Speak
Be quiet and speak loudly. Okay. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Penning the Past. My name is Irene McKisson. I'm your moderator. Welcome to the 2024 Festival of Books. The festival organizers want to thank the Bolin and Terrence family and Words, Women, and Wine Book Club for sponsoring this location. The Pi Beta Phi Fraternity, Arizona Alpha Chapter, the Friends of the Festival, and Rebecca Potter for sponsoring the upcoming discussion. The panel is going to end in 1 hour, so this is an hour session. We'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end, and then for a Q&A near the end here. Make sure you stop by the book sales area and the author signing at the sales and signing area. It's at the Uva Bookstore tent on the wall out there after the session. Book sales at the festival help support the cost of the festival and the local literacy programs it funds. You can also help keep this event free and open to everyone by becoming a friend of the festival or a sponsor of the festival. Please stop by the Friends booth or visit the website festivalbooks.org. Okay, as we begin, silence your phones, find a seat, and thank you for joining us today for the panel Penning the Past. We have Asha Lemmie, Elizabeth Silver, and Laura McNeal, our authors. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a bio about each of them, and then we're going to, the way we're kind of organized is I'm going to ask each of them a question about their individual books to talk a little bit about how it connects to the topic here today, and then we're going to have a discussion among all of us. Everybody still hear me okay? Okay. Okay, I'm going to start with Asha, who is next to me. Asha is a New York Times best-selling historical fiction author. Her debut novel, 50 Words for Rain, is about a biracial girl coming of age in post-war Japan. It made the New York Times, USA Today, Publishers Weekly, and indie bestseller list. Her newest novel, The Wildest Sun, is out. It came out December 5th, and it follows a young woman escaping her past in post-war Paris as she searches for the larger-than-life man she believes to be her father. Asha lives in New York City, and she's a graduate student at Columbia. Welcome, Asha. Laura McNeal is the author of Swan's Nest, which looks like this. I just like to see the book cover. Yes. I don't know what it is unless I see the cover. Laura's author of The Swan's Nest, which came out Tuesday, is that right?
This Tuesday.
This coming Tuesday.
But they were able to do it for their
Excellent. Okay. It's very good. You should get it. About an unlikely love affair between two great 19th century poets, Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett. She has written 3 other novels, including Dark Water, which is a finalist for the National Book Award in Young People's Literature. And with her husband, Tom, she's collaborated on 4 novels, a picture book, 2 sons, and the restoration of the historic house. They live near San Diego. And then at the end, we have Elizabeth Silver, who is the author of The Majority, which looks like this. It is a recently published novel about motherhood and ambition, love and friendship, and one woman's fight to be a Supreme Court justice, who you might recognize. She is also the author of the memoir, The Tincture of Time, a memoir of medical uncertainty, and the novel, The Execution of Noah P. Singleton. Elizabeth has worked as an attorney in California and Texas, and she teaches writing at UCLA. So welcome to all of our authors. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to kind of move down the line, and each author is going to talk a little bit about their book and a little bit about how that connects to historical fiction. I think as we get started, one of the interesting things I found about these 3 books is that they are all historical fiction, but they are all very different examples of what historical fiction can be, and like what the structure of it and what the kind of like format of it can be, and they're not necessarily all what you think of immediately when you think of historical fiction. I think that's a really interesting dynamic among these 3 books, so we'll hear a little bit about that. So I want to start with Asha. So you were a debut author who hit the New York Times bestselling list, so I want to talk about that a little bit with 50 Words for Rain. How did that accomplishment impact the development and trajectory of this book as your second novel, The Wildest Sun, which is also historical fiction? And then did you have the concept for The Wildest Sun in mind immediately? Like, were you already thinking about it, or did it develop after your debut novel? So maybe talk a little bit about how being a debut author with a sophomore novel like this, how that worked for you.
Well, I never really expected anyone to read my first book, except for my parents. So honestly, I was really taken aback when people did read it and it did do well, and it was it changed my entire life. I mean, one second I was like, I'm 23 and making $12 an hour. And the next second I had like a life and I could afford my own apartment, and it was really a special experience. And to have my book come out during COVID, I do feel like I missed out a little bit on the opportunity to meet people in person because everything was virtual, but at the same time, I still managed to reach a lot of people and connect with a lot of people. As far as how it influenced the writing of my second book, The Wildest Son, I found the second book a lot harder to write. I really struggled with it. I struggled with my confidence. I struggled with the weight of expectation that like, I'm going to do something very different than 50 Words for Rain, and I don't know if people are going to like it. But one thing I have on my bucket list before 30 is to stop caring so much what people think of me. So I decided that I was going to tackle this subject matter anyway, because I love Hemingway, and I love complicated, ambitious, slightly unhinged protagonists, and it was just something that I felt passionate about doing.
Can you talk a little bit about that, about the book itself and the kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit about girlhood, and it's a little bit of a like growing up novel, and how you use historical fiction to get there, maybe.
I always tend to gravitate towards coming of age stories, and I always tend to gravitate towards historical fiction because I think that people listen more when you frame things in the past. It's just a personal opinion that I have. I also find the past really interesting. In school, the only two classes I could ever really pay attention in were English and history. So it sort of feels like a cheat code that I just mashed them together to make a career. But that is what I did. That has worked for me. And I wanted to draw on Hemingway because he's such an iconic figure in American literature and just literature as a whole. And I thought to have this young girl, Delphine, spending her entire childhood, her formative years, believing that he is her father and that they have this connection, it really shapes her life. And I wanted to explore what that might look like to have your life shaped by a force that you have never been able to touch.
Yeah, you got it. Okay, Laura, let's talk about the Swansness a little bit. I don't mean to like brush past the book itself and go to the acknowledgments, but I was really interested in the acknowledgments because you talked a little bit about the amount of research that went into the book. And so I'm a journalist, and so this was really interesting to me personally because so much of journalism is research, and there's this moment where you have to turn that research into a book or like into a published thing, and it's a little bit hard sometimes to get that to that pivot point because it feels like, oh, I could just keep doing research for infinity. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you did that. So maybe you could talk about that research and then how it turned into this book, and give us a little bit about what the book is about and how you got there.
Okay. Well, I'll start with what it's about to explain how the research morphed. It is about the courtship of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. So it's not just historical fiction, it's biographical fiction. And I was initially struck by the story of their romance, which was essentially, they fell in love with each other's words. They fell in love with each other's poetry. And Robert had never even seen a picture of Elizabeth Barrett, not a drawing. I mean, there were no photographs of her, but he'd never even seen a drawing of her. And the first words that he wrote to her in a letter were, "I love your verses with all my heart, and I love you too." You know, that's just a big start to a relationship. And she was at that time an invalid, and she had been basically trapped in her house for 4 years. London was really polluted in the mid-19th century, and she had chronic lung ailments and other health things that were probably not diagnosed correctly because they couldn't examine her in the ways we can now. But I was initially just so struck by how Robert never wavered. He never stopped feeling that way. They didn't meet for 5 months. The minute he saw her, he knew. And so this intellectual relationship, and the letters are very, very intellectual. They're both really, I mean, they use a lot of arcane words, and they write long sentences, and they're just unbelievably beautiful. And they all, except for the one that she told him to burn, survived. So the research took a long time in that I really wanted to understand the context of their families. And Elizabeth was one of 12 children. 11 of whom survived to adulthood, and most of whom she lived with in her house. And at first I just couldn't even tell the brothers apart. So I went to England, I went to Rome, I went to Florence, I went to France, that they traveled through to get to Italy. I went to Jamaica where their sugar plantation was. And you know, fortunately my husband, whenever I said I need to go to Rome again, he was there. We went to Rome twice. I just felt it was really transgressive to start with, to write about people's lives, to presume that I could imagine. I had to imagine their thoughts, and I had to have imagine conversations, and the conversations don't survive. You know, I'm having to make those up, but I wanted them to be made up based on real, deep knowledge of who they were and what they did. So that's why the research took 6 years. So.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Elizabeth, so in your book, you fictionalize the life of the Supreme Court Justice, who closely resembles a real life figure. Very, very closely, like we've got a lot of parallels, right? Except I really enjoyed her acronym being SOB, that was fun. It was like just a little Easter egg in the book there a little bit. So I guess my question is really around like your previous work was your own memoir, and so I wonder how you decided on the structure of the majority, which is really like a historical fiction memoir almost. Like it's very memoir-esque. It's like you're in her memoir, and so I wondered whether your own memoir writing influenced that, and like how you came to that structure, and like how you got there. And then also if you could talk a little bit about the book for everybody so they can kind of hear about it.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So my first book was a novel, and the second one is a memoir, and then this one is, I guess we can call it a fake memoir. So it's a fictional memoir of a fictional first female Supreme Court justice in America who was inspired in many ways by the second, RBG, but she's really this amalgamation of all of them, of so many women, of Sandra Day O'Connor, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of other powerful women, of people I know, probably parts of me, like all of these women who have flaws, but are aiming to reach the top, and in a place that I kind of consider the closest thing we have to a modern throne. I mean, once you're on there for life, right? So I was really interested in exploring that, and part of it is because I'm a novelist, but I also have a law degree, so I was interested in kind of using that place to explore motherhood and ambition and in this world that we live in, and kind of taking it over 50 years from, you know, when she's a child in the late 40s to her appointment in the mid 80s. And so we know from the start that she's on the court. So it takes a place of, you know, it takes a form, it opens up saying, you know, found in the desk of the late Sylvia Olin Bernstein, Associate Justice, and she's the contemptuous SOB for her initials. And so I didn't necessarily think about the fact, my last book was a memoir, but I look at memoir and fiction very much in terms of structure and storytelling the exact same way. And I write them the same way because I think they're both getting to truths of our lives. They're both, you're attempting to find truth in the human experience. The only difference is that you're making up the story to get there. In fiction versus a memoir, you can't make it up, it's your story. And so I think in that sense, it was more, okay, well, I can make it up. I'm taking, very, very loosely, I'm starting off with a kind of this person who I admire, and, going off of what Laura was saying in terms of the research, because you were writing about real people, and I was completely fictionalizing somebody who has, familiarity, but she's not her at all. She kind of starts off that way, but when I got too much, I researched for years also, and I was researching, and I was like, I have to take a step back, because I'm not writing a fictionalized version of her. I'm writing a completely new person, and so the minute I got too into research, I was like, okay, wait, let me breathe, let me take a step back, and let me start, changing things. And I got stuck like 3 years into the project, and I remember talking to a dear writer friend of mine who we read each other's early drafts, and I was like, I don't know what to do, I don't know, did I lose 3 years of my life? Like, is this book going anywhere? And it was so simple. Like, at first, she was very much described, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or me, because I'm very short as well. And then she just change how she looks. It was so simple. It was like, she's now a tall blonde, not a short brunette redhead, or a short, whatever. And so I changed how she looked, and it was so clear. Everything kind of fell into place. And it's something so simple, but the way we look, it impacts how we navigate in the world. And so how people look at us, how people treat us, how, whether it's your skin color, your hair color, your religion, anything about us, that changes how we navigate the world. And so the minute I did that, she really became her own person. And I was able to follow that through. And so by still getting to the same truths that I wanted to explore about, motherhood and sacrifice and ambition and, exploring the 60s and 70s in the women's rights movement, but I got to make up a lot of her story, and but using kind of that idea of knowing that we're going to keep going back to this is a memoir.
Asha, I wonder about your research and where that took you, or how it shifted or didn't shift the story you wanted to tell about a coming of age story, because there is so much history in there, especially in the kind of post-war era, and we have so much of Paris in there, even though did we ever actually get to Paris? I don't think we ever do, but there's so much of Paris in it, and so I was just interested in how you brought those elements into this bigger story.
Well, it starts in Paris, and it ends in Paris,
Okay.
and that's all I'll say about That's all I'll say about that. So I think my research I was very intimidated because I knew from the beginning that Hemingway obviously is a huge legion of people who are very interested in his life. And this is not a Hemingway biography. And I was always very clear about that. He is a character in the novel. He is a concept in the novel, but this is not about him. And so it was important to me that I fleshed it out with a lot of history that really isn't about him. So it starts, Delphine comes of age right at the close of World War II, right when the Nazis have been forced out of their occupation of Paris. And then she ends up in Harlem, New York, and there's a whole jazz scene, there's a whole artistic scene, and there's also the budding rumblings of the civil rights movement. And I'm trying not to give too much away, but there's a huge part of the book that takes place in Cuba, and we all know what happened in Cuba, right? The Cuban Revolution. And I did actually find out something a little bit disturbing, which is that I have the same birthday as Fidel Castro, which was not on my bucket list. But that's okay. And when I did get to the research about Hemingway's life, obviously I had to follow his arc because the timeline of her journey is bound largely by the timeline of his life and his adventures. But I also got to do a lot of research before Delphine's birth, the things that were happening in the 20s, the stories that her mother was telling her about the Jazz Age and World War I. So I researched about 100 years of history for this book. And I learned a lot, of course, about Hemingway's life, but I also learned about the lives of people in general back then. And did you know that a loaf of bread used to cost 9 cents? Wow.
If only. If only it still did. Okay, so I'm going to go in order, however you want to organize yourselves. So I'm going to ask the question that the kind of panel description posits, which is how your unique experiences as authors, and we've gotten at this a little bit already, but how your unique experience influences the depictions of the historical figures in your books, and whether your own experiences provided you with insights that shaped your choices about the narrative. And Elizabeth, maybe we should start with Elizabeth, because you kind of started to go there, right? Of like, your physical appearance and how you had to kind of like take that out to be able to get where you were going. But I also wonder about the kind of the motherhood elements and like whether your experience as a daughter or as a mother shaped the way you kind of wrote that story.
Yes, thank you. And I love that the way that you asked that about my experiences as a mother or a daughter.
Well, it's all mixed up.
It's all mixed in there. Yes, exactly. Because usually when I talk about this book, people are like, okay, so what about your experiences as a lawyer? I'm like, no. But she is a lawyer, and she is, obviously ultimately gets to be on the Supreme Court, which is kind of the ultimate, the ultimate place to be. And like my like education in that world gave me the foundation to be able to write about the law, hopefully authentically as possible. But ultimately, I started this book because in my memoir, my last book, when I was going around promoting it, there wasn't a single event that I did almost entirely that somebody didn't ask me who was watching my kids. And this was 6 years ago. And I had little kids then, and I mean, they're still pretty young, but they're not that young. And it blew my mind. And I would see this everywhere with other writers, other authors. And I was like, what is going on? Haven't we gotten past all that? We should have been past all this. And so I started thinking about that and writing about that. And I wanted to explore, okay, well, what if we set this in a world in which, we're talking about some major issues here. We're at the highest place that we can discuss some of these issues, and we're still dealing with that. Well, what's wrong? Like, let's explore that. And so I'd say that she's definitely not me, and she's definitely not RBG, and she's definitely not Sandra Day O'Connor. Like, she's just this amalgamation, and she's flawed, and she makes mistakes. And I don't think there's a person alive who doesn't make mistakes, who isn't flawed. And I think that's what makes writing about characters who are complicated really interesting for writers. I think that other people on this panel have already said that. It's not always fun to get to write about somebody who does what one person thinks is always the right thing, because somebody else will think that something different is the right thing. Like, there's no right way to do anything. And so I'd say that it was inspired in large part because I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old and started writing this book, because I was also wondering, as I was working and going home and giving, trying to promote that memoir and everything, like, and I wondered, do other people who go home and feel like a fraud? Do some of these powerful women who we put on a pedestal as this kind of the zenith of like feminism or power, do they go home and feel like a fraud ever? And that was really something that I was curious about. And so I tried to put it all together in this world and in this character, and in her relationships with her friends and her mentors, her husband, her daughter, and herself.
Yeah, as a mother of a 14-year-old, I felt very seen in this book, the like fraught relationship as she gets older, and like that thing, right? Like, I have to go be the Supreme Court judge. I mean, she wasn't quite there. I have to go be this lawyer now, and I can't over here. And like, it was really, I felt very like you knew what you were talking about. Asha, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit next, just because I think there's a good segue there, because you talked about how you like to write these characters who are, I don't know, flawed is the right word, crazy, fun, wild, maybe is the right word, taken from your title, but maybe about, you could elaborate on that and about like how you, what you like about that and how you write it.
Well, I'm at a stage of life where I currently only have one perspective. I have no husband, I have no children. trying to fix the husband thing. And I think I still, I like to say, I buried the last piece of my girlhood in this novel. Like, in finishing this novel and in signing off on this, I think I'm done writing from the perspective of girls. I think I'm ready to move on to writing from the perspective of women. And that sort of feels like a step for me. But I really am so attracted to the psychology of coming of age, but I actually have realized it doesn't ever stop. There's never a point where you're like a magical, perfect adult who has everything figured out. And I somehow thought that was going to happen. It has not happened. I mean, honestly, sometimes I'm like, I need to find an adult. I can't handle this. But I think that just has opened up a whole new world for me as a writer, because like I can write fully adult characters who are still coming of age and who are still figuring a lot of things out. And even if you just change directions, I mean, my aunt got a divorce at 50 and she now teaches Spanish in Guatemala, which is so random. But like there's always new doors to open and new chapters to explore. So I want to get into trying to find that.
Well, you kind of feel that with Delphine as you go. Like I felt that as I was reading. Like I could see her growing up and her attitudes changing. And so at the beginning, you know the character where you're like, don't do that, don't do it. And then she, you know, like you could see her mature and become a woman and start making different choices. And it felt very like satisfying to see her like grow up and become that adult. And so I think you're right. We don't ever grow up, but it is fun to see the arc of somebody kind of finding themselves a little bit. And yeah, in the like backdrop of her history too is really great. Okay, so Laura, how do you see yourself in the book? Like,
We have a saying in our family, it's useful, especially on vacations, and it's wherever you go, you take yourself. And I can't ever completely leave my subjectivity, my personal viewpoint behind, as much as I might immerse myself in the worlds of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning and their many relations and friends. Their siblings were huge parts of their lives, as were their parents. And as I started reading biography after biography, that's where I started, and then I moved to the letters and to primary materials, I realized that the Victorian world is the one in which I've always felt most at home. And at first I thought that was related to the fact that when I was in high school, I read the book Test of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, and I fell in love with Thomas Hardy, and he became my favorite novelist, and then I read all the other Victorian novels, and I thought it was related mostly to literature. But I think that it was actually related to the fact that I grew up in a very devout family in a religion that was founded in 1830, which was during the Victorian era in the United States. My family were devout Mormons. And so whenever Robert and Elizabeth and their friends and their relatives quote scripture, I always know that scripture. And I understand their values as the values of the people who raised me. And they're very, duty is the most important value in their lives. Filial piety, taking care of their parents, taking care of their siblings. There are many maiden aunts in their family trees who do nothing but take care of the other members of the family. And I saw that at church and in my family, and so I have this love for that way of life. And I feel that I am essentially Victorian, trying to make my way through a modern Netflix world. So I'm just really never happier than when I'm not Victorian. Yeah.
well, people say that often, right? Like I was born in the wrong era.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's a cliche, and yet it's true for a lot of people. It's true for a lot of people. What is your nature, and what's your cultural setting?
Yeah, that is interesting. It gives me like a whole other layer to
He's the uber patriarch of Victorian fathers.
Yeah, it's fun to read it with that in mind. Okay, so in historical fiction, writers have to balance this thing that we've kind of touched on a little bit, which is between like a factual accuracy, and we have a range of this here too, which is kind of fun, with the kind of storytelling and the making, the like imaginative piece of this, of novel writing. And so how do you in particular fictionalize a historic account, or like without distorting the truth, or vice versa, how did you weave reality into a fictional narrative? And I think we have such a range, and it might be interesting to hear how you balance that. And we started talking about it a little bit already, right? Elizabeth with, trying to not put so much reality in. So maybe you could start and just talk a little bit more about that part of it.
Sure. So one thing that I made a point of, I kind of tried to create this kind of rubric for myself, like a set of laws for the majority that would be something that I would have to follow, like some rules. Since I didn't think I was writing historical fiction when I started this, and I still don't even think of it as historical fiction, which is kind of weird in a sense, because I mean it is. It's set in 49 and 60, or it's 1960s, 1973, and 1986, which is, I guess, historical fiction. But I didn't think about it that way, because when I started it, 10,000 drafts ago, I think it was like mostly set present day, and she was looking back and going back and forth and back and forth. So I've been on a lot of historical fiction panels, and I'm like, oh, I guess it is historical fiction. And so in doing so, because I had these fictional characters navigating actual history, like she goes to Harvard Law, and that's a real place. And she's working at this, winds up at the Supreme Court, which is a real place. But she's fictional. So how did I do that? I tried to make it clear. So she's a fictional character, and the people that she interacts with are fictional characters. But if she's at a real place, and so if she's talking about, and most of this is respect to kind of the institutions and the cases that she works on or that they discuss, real cases. And so if they discuss a case, then it's real. If she's at Harvard, it's real. She's at the Supreme Court, she's on the Third Court of Appeals, she's at real places. But if she's actively working on a case, that's fictional. If she's actively interacting with a character, that's a fictional person, because I didn't think it made sense to have fictional people interacting with real people. So I had to make sure that that's separate. So the real cases she never interacts, she doesn't work on them. She's not talking to real professors or real people. They might be inspired by actual cases, and so there's like a big through line of pregnancy discrimination, which becomes like her calling card. Like that is what she is focused on. And so the case that she works on is actually an amalgamation of like 3 or 4 real cases that I researched, and I kind of created a fictional one, a fake one that she gets to work on. But it wouldn't make sense for a sub-E, this fictional lawyer to work on an actual case. She wasn't going to work on Roe v. Wade, for example, but she mentions it because that's what happened at the time that she was coming into her own. But I had to make sure that that was separate. So that's how I navigated kind of the real versus the fictional, and I hope that it stayed that way throughout.
To just getting consistency, like to make sure that you were being consistent in that.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense if you've got somebody real navigating a fake world and vice versa. So yeah.
What about either of you? Like how did you navigate the balance there?
All right, well, I will jump in here. Because it slightly contradicts what Elizabeth just said in my process. As I said, I started with biographies, and I read one biography of Elizabeth Barrett, and then I read the next one, and I read the next one, and I read Robert Browning's biographies, and that created a structure in my mind. And a biography structure is and then, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. You can't write a novel like that. That's not the structure of a novel. The rules of art are not the rules of biography, and they're not the rules of reality either. So I realized somewhere along the line, 2 or 3 years in, that I needed to read novels again. And I read all Jane Austen again, I read all the Bronte novels, and I read a lot of Henry James that I'd never read before, and that immersed me in the world of the Victorians, but in the representational world. And I, at that moment, introduced a fictional person into my book of very many real people. There is an appendix in the back, and you can look up everyone who's real and what they did that comes into the book. But Lenore Goss is my invented character because I needed one person who could do whatever I needed her to do to make the story suspenseful. There's so much known about every single thing that happened to the Barretts and the Browns, and someone will say to you, well, no, that happened in the afternoon. I'm sorry, he's not the person who answered the door. Really, these things are recorded. And so I was just trapped in a cage of real times and weather. And Lenore Goss could go anywhere, say anything, do anything. And that really freaked me out.
Asha, what was your process like? How did you navigate those two, the balance?
Well, the only real person in my book is Hemingway. So, yeah, it's really the opposite. But Hemingway is so well known that I actually tried to use him sparingly because I didn't want him to eclipse the fictional characters that I was creating, because that is my job as a novelist. As was already said, it's not a biography. I don't do that. So for me, I really wanted the focus to remain on my characters and their relationships to each other, and then Hemingway sort of functions as a conduit in the novel, and I think that's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, I liked how you said earlier that he's a character in your novel. Like, he's a historical figure who's just a character in a way for you to kind of further the story, to tell the story of Delphine. Okay, so a little bit more about maybe process, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So I guess I'll just pose the question to the group, like, how is historical fiction process different than other process? So we've talked about a little bit, like, you've got some rules, you had so much research. Asha, you talked a little bit about how you are trying to balance telling the story with having this historical figure. What other process stuff came up for you as you were writing these?
Well, I mean, I think there is a part of me that really wishes that I were more of a librarian. I'm really not very organized, and so the hardest part for me was that part of the process. I mean, I would read a book and I would take notes, and I would do it on paper with a pen. And then the next time I read a book, I'd be taking notes and it would be on a Kindle, and it would be in there. And then the next book that I read, I would have on my phone with me, and I would take notes, and then I would have on and on and on. I have digital files and I have paper files, and I have photographs that number in the thousands of places that I went. I want to take a picture of every single thing in case I needed that, because I needed to know what the floor was like in the room where they had the scene. But then I can't find the picture. So like, was that 2016? So I think the organizational process is something I've learned along the way, but that is actually really tremendously hard when you're trying to keep it very strictly adhering to the facts. Good job. So smart. Yeah, I think you both. Just called her something other than Elizabeth Barrett.
So this was set, I mean, like I said, I didn't think it was historical, but, so it's so recent history, or I think it's recent history, that in which it's set, in which the book is set, but I'd never really done that before, and so my last books were contemporary, and so what was hard for me is that I was fictionalizing, things that were happening in our real world, and then they would happen, and I would have to go back and rewrite because it looked like I was copying what was happening in real life. And then I would write, and then it would happen again, and it kept going and going. I was like, oh God, I can't do this again. So once I finished this, again, that was part of I think the pull to say, okay, I'm not setting it any time now. I'm not doing right now. I'm going to go back 30, 40 years. And then I'm just thinking about, like, in my next book, I'm like, okay, I'm toggling between two of my next projects, and one is speculative in the future, and we have no idea what it's going to be like. The other one is like far back in antiquity, in which, you know, it's more about world building and tone, and less about, because you can't prove what happened, you know, 5,000 years ago is that much, right? So I think in that sense, you know, it was a struggle, because I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want it to look like I was just copying current events, which I wasn't, you know. And so now, yeah, I'm looking to not do that again.
You learned a lesson.
Asha, what about you? What was your process like?
I'm not very organized either. I have a separate document where I keep all of my research, like my Hemingway research. I would break it down into categories, like I would have like time period, fashion, food, and then I also had, because my novel takes place in so many countries, I had a whole separate section for culture. And I had my Hemingway facts, like, and I would try to sort of keep them all balanced in order to set the scene. So like I learned that Hemingway wrote standing up. Hemingway scribbled on the wallpaper in his bathroom when he was in the bathtub. And I thought, well, this is weird, and I can't just dump this. You have to find an intelligent way to disperse information in a novel. So this is something that it's Delphine's mother could have told her. And so I try to make my scenes multifunctional. So this scene gives character, it gives the relationship between Delphine and her mother, it gives that historical tidbit, and it also gives culture and place. So that is sort of how I try to mix it all together. It is not as organized as maybe it just sounded out loud.
You know what you're doing. Well, I mean, I will say, like, when you said that, I thought to myself, oh, that's why Delphine's so obsessed with Hemingway, because you needed somebody